In 1998, a choir of 6 girls from Birmingham boarded a church bus after a recording trip to Nashville and were never seen again. For 20 years, families waited for answers while investigators chased leads that went nowhere. Then, in 2018, a park ranger's flashlight caught something hidden in the dark, clues that would not only reopen the case, but reveal twists no one had expected. The Johnson family from Birmingham, Alabama, felt the loss deeply. Their daughter, Destiny, had been the choir's main singer. She was 16 and well known in her neighborhood for her singing voice. It was strong and moving, the kind that filled up churches and school halls. Destiny wanted to teach music someday. Her parents used to say she had the type of voice that made people pause and pay attention. After the bus disappeared, the Johnson house became quiet in a way that stayed. Destiny's mother, Carolyn, kept her daughter's bedroom the same way it had been. The music posters on the walls had gotten old and faded, but the bookshelf with church songbooks and notebooks full of song words stayed exactly where they were from 1998. Carolyn couldn't bring herself to move those things because it would feel like giving up on her daughter completely. Her husband, Marcus, dealt with things differently. He put all his energy into church activities and helping the community. He organized events to raise money so they could keep looking for the missing kids. As the years went by, both parents became known around town mainly as the couple whose daughter never made it home from that trip. The Williams family carried a different kind of loss. Their daughter Mariah had been the choir's piano player. At 17, Mariah was quiet and thoughtful, known less for talking and more for how her fingers moved over piano keys. She had saved up for years to buy a used keyboard, teaching herself church songs and jazz music by listening. Her parents, Walter and Denise Williams, remembered how Mariah had wanted to bring sheet music on the trip to Nashville. She had planned to practice even on the bus. Unlike the Johnsons, who stayed home with their memories, the Williams family kept moving. Walter ran a small car repair shop, and after Mariah disappeared, he often stayed open late, fixing cars as a way to keep his mind busy. Denise joined groups for families of missing people, traveling to meetings in other states. She found some comfort in talking with people who understood what it meant to live without answers. Still, every holiday and birthday came with the same empty chair, a reminder of what was gone. Both families struggled with having no real ending to their story. In the early years, they held on to hope that maybe the choir had been taken and was still alive somewhere. Stories would come up now and then about possible sightings. People claimed they saw a group of young people at a rest stop or heard about a bus in another state, but nothing ever turned out to be true. Each failed lead made the pain deeper. Over 20 years, the sadness turned into something they learned to live with. The Johnsons and Williams, though they handled things differently, often found themselves together at memorial services and anniversary events. In church basements and community halls, they lit candles, sang songs, and kept wondering what had happened to the voices of hope. For them, the cave discovery was more than just evidence. It was a sudden, painful return to wounds they had learned to carry quietly. The uniforms didn't bring peace. They brought back the nightmare of not knowing. Had the children been forced into the cave? Were they left there? And why, after so long, did these pieces surface now? As word of the Rangers' discovery spread, local police called the families once more. This time, after 2 decades of silence, there was something new to look at. Carolyn Johnson sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone long after the call ended. Denise Williams, on the other side of town, reached for the same folder she always kept nearby. It held newspaper clippings, missing person flyers, and photographs of Mariah. Both women later said the moment felt like losing their children all over again. For 20 years, they had lived with their absence. Now, finding choir robes in a cave suggested a darker story had always been waiting. In the summer of 1998, the Voices of Hope Girls Youth Choir left Birmingham, Alabama, full of excitement. The group had 6 members who were known in their community for their energy and talent. They had just finished recording a CD in Nashville to raise money for future trips and competitions. It was their first time in a real recording studio. Photos from that weekend showed them smiling in their choir robes, standing outside the booth with their director, Reverend Samuel Ellis. The trip home should have been simple. They chartered an older white bus with green stripes, driven by Walter Price, who worked part-time for several church groups. The plan was to leave Nashville in the afternoon, stop once for gas and food, and get back to Birmingham before dark. Parents waited in the church parking lot with their headlights on, ready to welcome them home. The bus never arrived. At first, families thought there had been a delay. Parents called each other asking if anyone had heard from the choir. Some figured the bus had broken down or was caught in traffic. But as hours passed, worry spread through the group. By midnight, everyone knew something was wrong. The search started the next morning. State police, local officers, and volunteers spread out across highways and back roads. Helicopters scanned the mountain areas. It became one of the biggest local searches Alabama had seen in years. Late that afternoon, they found the bus. It sat on the shoulder of a narrow mountain highway that curved sharply before dropping toward a wooded valley. The headlights were off and the engine was cold. The door was closed but unlocked, as if the driver had just stepped away for a moment. Inside, the scene made no sense. Sheet music was scattered across the seats, and some personal bags were still in the overhead compartments. The driver's wallet sat on the front dash with cash still inside. A pair of choir shoes was left under one seat, but there were no signs of the girls, Reverend Ellis or Walter Price. Police examined the bus carefully. The gas tank was half full and nothing seemed damaged. They checked for fingerprints and tested the locks, but found no signs the bus had been broken into. There were no skid marks on the road and no signs of a crash. A few smudged footprints in the dirt near the door showed some movement, but not enough to explain where 6 girls and 2 adults had gone. One state trooper said it looked like they had just stepped off and disappeared. Families were heartbroken. Candlelight services began right away. Flyers with the girls' faces were printed and spread across Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. Tips came in constantly. Someone thought they saw the bus at a truck stop. Another person reported seeing a group of girls at a diner miles away. Every lead was checked, but none led anywhere. Within weeks, the case went cold. For years, the families kept pushing authorities for answers. Some parents drove the highways themselves, stopping at rest areas and wooded trails, hoping to find something. Others wrote letters to state officials asking for more help. Every year, they gathered at the church to remember the anniversary. But as time went on, the story disappeared from the news. By the mid-2000s, the search had slowed. Leads grew fewer, and official attention shifted elsewhere. By 2014, the bus and the missing choir were spoken of mostly in past tense, a painful memory rather than an active case. That changed in 2018, when a park ranger's discovery inside a cave brought the mystery back into focus. Detective Maria Martinez was put on the cold case. She was younger than some of the parents, but had a reputation for not giving up. When the uniforms were confirmed to belong to the choir, Martinez made calls no one expected after 20 years. She started with the Johnsons. Carolyn Johnson almost didn't answer the phone, thinking it was a sales call. When she heard the detective introduce herself, she sat down at her kitchen table. Martinez explained carefully that uniforms matching the Voices of Hope had been found in a cave system several counties away. They were severely damaged, but could still be identified. Tests were still being done. Next, she called the Williams family. Denise Williams listened quietly before asking if this meant the girls were alive. Martinez couldn't give her an answer. All she could say was that evidence had been found and the case was officially open again. News spread quickly among the other families. Some felt hopeful, thinking new evidence meant new leads. Others were scared, worried the robes meant the worst had happened. At a quick church meeting, parents sat in folding chairs while Martinez explained what they knew so far. She showed pictures of the cave and uniforms, but avoided guessing what it meant. She told them they were starting over and would follow the evidence. For the families, hope and fear mixed together. Some held on to the idea that the girls had survived somewhere, waiting to be found. Others prepared themselves for news they had long dreaded. After 20 years of silence, the case of the Voices of Hope Choir was no longer just a memory. It was active again, demanding answers that had never been given. When investigators went back to the cave where the uniforms were found, they went deeper inside. What first looked like a single room turned out to connect to a much larger system of tunnels. Old wooden beams lined parts of the passage, some falling apart from years of moisture and decay. Mining tools, rusted and broken, were scattered in corners. The ranger who found the uniforms had thought someone was mining illegally, and now the signs were clear. Someone had worked here years earlier, cutting into the rock for copper. Geologists brought in by the state confirmed the tunnels were not natural. They showed clear marks of drilling and blasting, the kind used in mining that should have required permits. But no records of such operations existed in county or state files. Whoever had run the mine had done so in secret. For the families, this discovery was disturbing. It suggested their daughter's disappearance might be connected to something much bigger than anyone had thought in 1998. Detective Martinez began looking through old employment records from mining companies in the area. What she found was troubling. Walter Price, the bus driver who disappeared with the choir, had once worked for Copper Ridge Minerals, a company that operated several mines in the region. His name appeared on payroll records in the late 1990s, listed as a transportation contractor. It wasn't clear why he had left, but a gap in his work history matched exactly when the company shut down several sites due to financial problems. At first, Martinez thought this might just be a coincidence. People often work different jobs in rural areas, and driving a bus didn't necessarily mean anything suspicious. But when she got Copper Ridge's financial records through court orders and state files, she noticed strange payments. Some entries were unclear, listed under transportation services, and sent through fake company accounts. Several matched up with the date the choir disappeared. The families, already upset after 20 years of no answers, pushed harder for information. Martinez tracked down former employees. Most had moved to different states after Copper Ridge shut down. A few spoke carefully about safety problems and unpaid wages. Others refused to talk at all. Then one lead changed everything. A widow living 2 counties away agreed to meet with Martinez. Her name was Helen Carr, and her husband Daniel had been a supervisor at Copper Ridge in the early 1990s. Helen described her late husband as a careful man who worried about the shortcuts being taken at the mine. He had told her about poor airflow, collapsing tunnels, and waste being dumped into streams. But what bothered him most wasn't just safety. It was the people he claimed were being brought in after regular hours. According to Helen, her husband noticed younger faces appearing at the site during odd hours. These were teenagers and young adults who didn't look like miners or regular workers. He never called it trafficking, but Helen remembered how uncomfortable he became when talking about people who didn't belong there. He told her that if anything happened to him, she should remember his notes. In 2005, Daniel Carr died in what the company called a workplace accident. He was found at the bottom of a service shaft. The official explanation was that he had fallen while checking equipment. Helen was never convinced. She remembered that in the weeks before his death, he had started bringing copies of documents home, hiding them in a metal box in their garage. After his funeral, she looked for the box, but it was gone. For years, Helen kept her doubts to herself. She raised her children, worked 2 jobs, and tried not to think about the company that had taken her husband. But when news broke that choir uniforms had been found in a Copper Ridge cave, she contacted the detective. She told Martinez that if those kids ended up there, it wasn't an accident. Her husband always said the company was hiding something. Martinez took her statement seriously. She compared Helen's story with the court-ordered records. There were problems with transportation payments that happened during the same week the bus disappeared. The documents didn't name specific people, but the timing couldn't be ignored. The discovery hit the families hard. They had lived for years with uncertainty, but now they faced the possibility that their daughters had been caught up in something planned. At a meeting in the same church basement where memorial services had been held, the parents sat quietly as Martinez explained the mining connection. Martinez couldn't give them a clear answer about what had happened. What she could say was this: the cave wasn't just a random hiding place. It had been part of a larger, hidden operation connected directly to the company the bus driver had worked for. And the widow's story suggested the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. For the first time in 20 years, the disappearance of the Voices of Hope wasn't being treated as a lost bus or an unexplained accident. It was being viewed as a conspiracy involving powerful people who had managed to stay hidden for decades. The uniforms in the cave were not just proof of presence. They were the first crack in a wall of silence that had kept the families from knowing what really happened. Detective Martinez left the church basement with more questions than answers. The widow's testimony and the mining connection were enough to reopen the case, but without solid proof, it was still just a trail of possibilities. That changed when the paper records finally arrived from the state archives. Among hundreds of pages of financial records, Martinez found an unusual entry dated June 12, 1998, the same day the choir disappeared. A payment had been made from a Copper Ridge subsidiary to a private event planning company. The amount wasn't huge, but the memo line was striking. Performance, youth choir. No group was named, but the timing and location matched too closely to ignore. When she traced the payment further, it led to a private gathering at a mountain estate owned by Richard Halbrook, a senior executive at Copper Ridge. Halbrook was known for his wealth and privacy. His estate sat on hundreds of acres of land, surrounded by forests and old service roads that locals rarely used. Few people in town had ever been near it. Martinez presented the information to the families at their next meeting. She explained carefully that this wasn't proof, but the records showed that a choir had been hired for a private party the night their daughters disappeared. The company executive who paid for it was directly connected to the caves where the uniforms were found. The room went quiet. Some parents stared down at their hands. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The thought was hard to accept. For years, they had imagined accidents, chance encounters, maybe even a bus hijacking. Now they had to consider that their daughters had been brought to entertain people who would later cover up their disappearance. Martinez applied for access to property records connected to Halbrook's estate. The place had been abandoned for more than a decade after his death, but county files still listed its boundaries and structures. Along with the main house, there had been a guest house, several barns, and access roads leading into wooded hills. Most interesting was a note that the property included sealed service tunnels from older mining surveys. Authorities agreed to a controlled site visit. Martinez, along with deputies and a small group of parents, traveled to the estate for a preliminary look while forensic teams prepared for a full search. The drive itself felt uncomfortable. The road narrowed as they climbed into the hills, lined with overgrowth that covered the edges of cracked pavement. At the gate, the old iron arch still bore the Halbrook name, though rust had eaten away at the letters. The main house stood ahead, tall but falling apart, its windows dark and empty. Inside, dust and mildew covered every surface. Furniture was draped with sheets yellowed by age. The smell of damp wood filled the air. The families walked slowly through rooms that felt frozen in time, chandeliers coated in grime, bookshelves lined with rotting books, and walls where portraits had been removed, leaving pale outlines behind. Deputies kept them close, reminding everyone this was only a first look. Outside, behind the barns, more troubling signs appeared. One deputy pointed out shallow ruts in the hardened ground, faint but still visible under weeds. They curved toward a concrete slab covered by brush. When the officers cleared it, they revealed a sealed hatch, leading down into darkness. The lock was rusted beyond use, but the hatch itself remained heavy and intact, an entry point to something below the estate. County records confirmed the hatch was connected to an old survey tunnel from when Halbrook's family first bought the land. Officially, the tunnels had been sealed years earlier. Yet here was an entrance that had clearly been reinforced and maintained. For the families standing above it, the implications were devastating. If the choir had been brought here, The tunnels might have been where they were taken afterward. Authorities promised a full forensic search. Teams of specialists were scheduled to enter the tunnels while the families were taken back to Birmingham. But word of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters began following the story, pressing officials for statements about the estate, the financial records, and the caves. For the first time in 20 years, the mystery of the Voices of Hope was no longer buried under silence. In Birmingham, the families held another meeting. Tension ran high. Some parents were angry that a powerful man's estate had been linked to their daughters only now. Others held on to a fragile hope that evidence from the tunnels would finally explain what happened. Martinez understood the weight of their demands. She had followed financial paper trails and found hidden property files, but she knew that until physical evidence was pulled from the estate, everything was still guesswork. She told the families the answers were closer than they had ever been. The search teams prepared to enter the tunnels under Holbrook's land. No one could yet say what would be found. But for the parents, the direction was clear. Their daughters had not disappeared into thin air. They had been taken somewhere specific, to a place connected to wealth and power. After 2 decades, the estate stood as a silent witness to what had happened in the mountains. The search team entered the tunnels under Holbrook's abandoned estate 2 weeks after the family's visit. Engineers reinforced the hatch before lowering equipment inside. What they found went far beyond the expected remnants of a mining survey. The tunnel led down steep steps carved into rock, reinforced by beams that were newer than the surrounding wood. Electrical wiring ran along the walls, brittle with age, but clearly installed years after the mine should have been sealed. At the bottom, the passage opened into a wide chamber. Mattresses, broken cots, and rusted metal chairs were scattered across the floor. Along the walls, shelves held tin cans, plastic jugs, and boxes of supplies. It was not the look of a natural cave. It was a place that had once been used for living. Investigators moved carefully from room to room. In one section, makeshift partitions of plywood and tarps created narrow sleeping quarters. Another chamber contained work areas, rusted pickaxes, worn gloves, and buckets lined with mineral dust. The deeper the team went, the clearer the picture became. This was not just an abandoned mine. It had been converted into a hidden prison. For the families waiting above, news filtered out slowly. Officials confirmed the tunnels contained evidence of long-term habitation. The question no one dared ask was whether anyone had survived inside. Then came the announcement. 2 women had been found alive in one of the deeper chambers. Malnourished, dehydrated, and unable at first to walk on their own, they were rushed to medical teams stationed at the site. It was them, the missing choir girls, now adults in their mid-30s. The news spread quickly, first among the families, then across the country. After 2 decades of silence, 2 of the 6 choir members were alive. In the days that followed, details of their ordeal emerged slowly. At first, the women were too weak to speak for long. Over the following weeks, through carefully guided interviews, fragments of their story began to form a clearer picture. They recalled being taken to Holbrook's estate under the pretense of performing. After singing in front of a small group of executives and guests, they were led away from the main house, down service paths toward the barns. From there, they were forced into the tunnels. They remembered Reverend Ellis protesting and trying to shield them, only to be beaten and taken away. Walter Price, the driver, was not seen again after that night. Inside the tunnels, time blurred. They were given basic food and water, but forced to work in areas too dangerous for regular miners. Their tasks included hauling buckets, clearing rubble, and sorting mineral fragments. The girls were told repeatedly that no one would ever look for them underground. Guards watched over them, sometimes men from the company, sometimes hired locals who spoke little. The testimonies described years of harsh treatment. The survivors spoke of intimidation, of punishments for refusing to work, and of abuse that left lasting physical and emotional scars. They had tried to resist. At least twice they attempted escape, but the tunnels were guarded and the entrances sealed with heavy locks. The darkness, the isolation, and the constant presence of armed men made survival the only option. As years passed, the group got smaller. The first girl to die had grown weaker each year. The toxic dust in the tunnels and constant strain on her lungs made it hard for her to breathe. With no medical help, she eventually collapsed and never recovered. Another was killed when she tried to protect the others from abuse. She stepped forward to shield them, and the response was immediate and brutal. 2 more died during the later years, their health destroyed by untreated injuries and harsh conditions underground. Their bodies were left in unmarked sections of the mine, some of which later collapsed. By the time rescuers arrived in 2018, only 2 of the original 6 choir members were still alive. By the late 2000s, the operation above ground began to fall apart. Guards stopped coming as often, supplies became irregular, and eventually the site was abandoned. The survivors learned to live off what was left behind, stockpiled food, stored water, and salvaged materials from the tunnels. This shift made their survival over nearly 2 decades possible. Despite the horror, the 2 who remained alive leaned on each other to endure. They sang hymns softly in the darkness, trading verses from memory when sheet music was taken from them. They marked time in whispered prayers, reminding themselves of the families who might still be waiting above ground. When investigators reached them in 2018, the women were frail, their eyes unaccustomed to daylight, but their voices carried the truth of what had happened. Medical teams confirmed the survivors bore scars from years of labor, joint damage, lung problems, and untreated injuries. At a nearby hospital, after days of stabilization, the families were brought in one by one. Carolyn Johnson embraced her daughter, Destiny, tears streaming down her face. Denise Williams, seeing her daughter alive after 20 years, could barely speak. The reunions were private at first, shielded from cameras. Later, when the survivors chose to share their story, they made clear their voices were evidence. They wanted the world to know what had been hidden in the mountains. When investigators shared the full truth with the families, the news cut deep. For 20 years, they had balanced hope and dread. Now there was finally an answer. The parents of the girls who had died stood together in silence. They lit candles that night in the church, placing 6 photographs at the front, 2 with flowers of welcome, 4 with black ribbons of mourning. The survivors' testimonies pushed the investigation forward. Within weeks, the FBI and federal prosecutors launched coordinated raids. Former Copper Ridge executives and contractors were arrested on charges of conspiracy, trafficking, and covering up environmental crimes. Several guards who had worked at the tunnels were tracked down in neighboring states. Local officials came under scrutiny for taking bribes to ignore illegal operations. The arrests brought headlines across the country. For the families, it was justice long denied. But even as charges were filed, none of it could erase the years lost or lives taken. In the months that followed, the community of Birmingham held services for both the survivors and the 4 who had died. Murals were painted near the church where the choir had once practiced, showing 6 young faces in maroon robes. School programs were created in their names. The survivors asked that their friends be remembered, not for how they died, but for the songs they once sang. The case moved slowly through federal courts, with multiple indictments secured and long prison sentences expected for those convicted. Yet closure did not mean peace for anyone involved. The families still carried the weight of 20 years without answers, of birthdays missed and milestones uncelebrated, of empty chairs at family tables during holidays. For the 2 survivors, healing would be a lifelong process as they worked to rebuild lives that had been stolen from them during their most formative years. The story of the Voices of Hope became more than a mystery solved. It became a reminder of how power and corruption can bury the truth, and how silence can last for decades when no one dares to speak. The discovery of the uniforms, the courage of a widow to share her late husband's doubts, and the persistence of investigators had finally brought the truth to light.